And now, without further ado, I am excited and grateful to welcome our speaker, Eric Edward. Eric Edward is an award-winning Indigenous nature educator and ecological forester with more than 25 years of experience helping to restore our native Wabanaki Acadian forest. Eric is the director of Macphail Woods Ecological Forestry Project and has been instrumental in its growth and success. Over the years, Eric has helped build the Sharing a Love for Nature summer camps and School of Woodland Ecology. In 2023, Eric also authored Supporting Teachers, a Field Guide to Nature Education, which introduces his unique approach to ecological education that focuses on developing learning languages. So, without further ado, welcome, Eric, and thank you for speaking today.
Thank you, Montaka. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen now. How's that look? Awesome. Okay, yeah. So my name's Eric Edward. Um, just a little bit about Macphail's before we get started. I'm already talking too fast. So Macphail Woods, we're a project of the Environmental Coalition of PEI, which is a not-for-profit charity here in Prince Edward Island. The project started in 1991. And we are sited on this historic Sir Andrew Macphail homestead property in Orwell. And our mission is to provide our community with the knowledge, skills, and materials to take positive environmental actions. And really, like Aldo Leopold has always been a big inspiration for us. And here's a quote that kind of helps guide our mission. And I think is just a good focus for what we're discussing today. The land is a fountain of energy running through the soil, plants, and animals, and we are part of it too. So the project started really just as a series of trails. Gary Schneider, our founder, he was asked to create a trail system on the historic property, and he saw it as a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate ecological forestry practices, specifically as an alternative to conventional forestry, which consisted of clear cutting and plantations. To do PEI has an incredibly, and we'll discuss this more, but has an incredibly long history of kind of aggressive land use. It is every inch of it has been cut, which has resulted in a loss of diversity, age, height, the whole thing. So our forests have been pretty beat up. And to restore the forest, Gary quickly realized that he needed to have an access to native species. And so he started a small native plant nursery, and more than just trees. He collected shrubs, wildflowers, ferns, the whole thing, and started using those in the restoration work. So that was in 1991. That's a long time before native species kind of have become uh, more widely accepted as an important part of restoration work. So, along with the forest demonstration, along with the native plant nursery, Gary also made education a focal point of the work we do here at Macphail's. So, right from the start, it was engaging the community, school groups. You know, we do a lot. So all that sort of stuff just kept growing. So our nursery expanded from that little plot you initially saw. It just kept growing over the last 35 years now. We initially just had a little tiny shed that had a couple of shovels in it and an old gross chainsaw. And we restored a barn and created a nature center. So today we now have over 5 acres of native plant nursery. And we have a beautiful nature center that we do all sorts of education work in. And so just a quick note on native species. Again, Gary's insight right from the bat was that if we're going, like, we need to work with the plants that have co-evolved with our fauna. So he was an avid birder, and it was seeing those connections between bird species, plant species, and then kind of looking more broadly at the whole plant and animal community that I realized that these connections are vital to restoration. So, for example, the ruby-throated hummingbird, its migration return to PEI kind of coincides with the flowering of our native honeysuckle. And that's just one of countless connections between these species. So if we're going to create healthy communities in our ecology, we really want to work with the plants and animals that have evolved and over the last 10,000 years. So right now in our native plant nursery, we're growing over probably 150 species of tree, shrub, wildflower, fern, the whole thing. We use those sales to kind of support our project, um, and we use them in our restoration work. And a lot of we do target rare species as much as we can, just because in PEI we have extirpated more species than any other province. So we have, yeah, we've really worked on getting numbers of rare species back. So things like witch hazel, hobblebush, yellow violet, Canada anemone, rock harlequin, are all species, examples of species that we've really were only existed on one or two properties on PEI, but now have a much greater population. And I mean, Gary's whole idea was that if you just do it, you just collect the seed, you plant it, you grow it, and then you restore it to nature, and the solution is in a way that simple. We also do education, so we run summer camps, as was mentioned. The goal is to take children from being comfortable in nature to having a breadth of knowledge about nature and actually to be capable in nature. So we start at age 6 and we go all the way to 16. And by the end, they're creating their own shelters, cooking their own food, lighting their own fires, stuff like that. But also doing it in a way that's actually restorative as much as possible. So we teach them to prune, to identify species so that when they make choices about what they use, they're uh, using it to improve the forest around them. We do school visits. We've developed lots of content, books. Supporting teachers has been a really successful product for teachers or book for teachers, and really does focus on our kind of approach to nature education, which is kind of founded around this idea of learning languages. So using language to help us see what's in front of us. So rather than teaching someone to identify species, we're really focused on all the aspects of whatever topic we're discussing, whether it's, so for example, with birds, if we can describe their beaks, feet, and feathers, then you can glean a whole lot of information from what you're looking at and then connect it to a name at the end of that. So without that kind of key language, it's you're going to lose the ability to kind of see what's in front of you. We last year we did 88 events, and some of those are week-long courses. We have teachers conventions. We do everything from university courses to volunteer events to one-off workshops. So we're, owl prowls, all sorts of stuff. So we're just trying to reach the community in as many ways as possible. And then on top of that, we're also a working forestry project. So we have a mill, we have harvesting equipment, we manage that's me tree climbing. Um, and the province, about 20 years ago, gave us 2,000 acres of public land to manage, as well as this property here at Macphail's. So they're kind of in our community, and but again, they're just it's a place for us to do restoration work, but also harvest lumber as well. And our kind of model of forestry, our kind of goal is always to define forest management with timber products as a byproduct of its primary function, which is sustaining biological diversity and maintaining long-term ecosystem health. And that's a quote from Dr. Ken Lertzman. Um, and again, it's super important, especially in the context of what we're talking about today, and thinking about how we and forests interact in a changing climate and those kind of extreme events that are happening. Um, how do our actions affect the resilience of forests, and really how do we even think about resilience? So this is I'm not an expert by any means in any of these things. So these are kind of my insights, having lived through these events. I think it is a good way of putting it. It's a story. And really, I just wanted to just to share my thoughts on where we're at in terms of building a pathway forward for forests and forest health. So in PEI, we about 3, 4 years ago now, we had post-tropical storm Fiona. So that was kind of a major uh, weather event that resulted from climate change. And in 4 hours, I watched a lot of my life's work get wiped out. So areas and forests that we had been carefully planting in, pruning, creating patch cuts. Um, it just disappeared in that time, and it was a devastating event. That picture on the left is our road into Macphail's, and it was full of trees. And that was the story everywhere on PEI. We spent the first week just working in the community to actually free people from their homes. Um, and then once we actually got into our forests, it was shocking. So that's a picture on the right of a hemlock that blew down in the storm along our streamside trail. And it really was a profound lesson about land use and its effects on forest resilience. And in PEI, we have such a fragmented forest that a huge part of what we're kind of contending with post-tropical storm Fiona is how we create connectivity again in our forests. Um, so what I'm again this we're in a unique system here at this point where we have had, you know, decades and decades of human intervention in forests, where we have created new cycles, changed cycles, altered the way that nature acts in a lot of ways. Certainly in PEI we have. And so our forests are less resilient, but more than that, we've also created kind of feedback loops in terms of what's happening. So we have forests that are more susceptible to, for example, windstorms, forest fires, but those events then in turn create a forest that are more susceptible to things like insect infestation, which then in turn create a higher chance of there being forest fires. So we're creating these kind of feedback loops within our forests that are really concerning, and we're seeing them kind of all around the world as well. So it's not just here in the Maritimes, but like everywhere. And I think a lot of these problems arise from how we think about the way the outcomes that we get from a forest. And so, typically we think of, ecological, social, and economic values, kind of being, coming from our forests. But I think that that's a real problem because really two of those are kind of actually necessary, um, natural, real things, and one of them is kind of an abstract concept. And so to put them on an equal playing field, or as three pillars or three legs of a stool, can be confusing. So again, to kind of get back to Ken Lertzman's point about, the primary goal of a forest is to provide us with the essential components of what actually create and sustain life on the planet, has to be the priority. So we really want to think about shifting those pillars to really bricks. And at the base of that building, we have our ecological outcomes and values. On top of that, we have our social, you know, uh, community, and last are economic. And those again all connect, and they can all be relate to one another. And obviously, we need to develop economic outcomes, but those cannot happen at the expense of our ecological. And I think that we're kind of figuring that out dramatically at this point, as we're seeing that as we have denuded our ecological resilience, the effects on our forests are extreme, and these feedback loops are real. So I just want to get into a little bit of the history of what happened here in PEI because it's a good microcosm of kind of what's happening in the world. So colonialization, PEI was completely forested, and immediately it was cleared both for agriculture but also for the sale of timber. It fueled a shipbuilding industry, and in turn, those ships were filled with timber and sent to Europe. And an enormous amount of wealth was generated through this process. Those forests became farms. The farms were in turn, um, uh, the energy system was based on hay and feeding horses. And so most of the island was the lowest point of forested that we had forest cover on PEI was during the Confederation. So since then, we've actually regained a lot of forest. So PEI was almost completely, well, it was definitely cut from tip to tip. Um, kind of post World War II, a lot of those fields were abandoned and colonized by white spruce. And white spruce typically was a coastal species that grew in hedgerows. As a middle of a field is a lot like a coast. And then once fields at the back of properties or low value fields were abandoned, they colonized much of the island. So really, what a lot of people think of when we think of PEI forests are these kind of old field white spruce stands. And then kind of as new methodologies of forestry arrived, silviculture, industrial models, which were clear cutting and plantations, based on kind of developing sustainable yields. Those old field white spruce were harvested and then converted into plantations. And those plantations have really been growing since then. So a lot of our forests on PEI are now old plantations. Things like red pine, white spruce, even black spruce, a lot of conifers. So in a lot of ways, we further borealized our forests here on PEI. And again, the model of that's the science, the idea, the whole model was based on developing a forest product, developing timber that could be turned into boards and sold. And, that was the kind of that was, all the science and math was based on kind of creating a system that could consistently develop that product. The issue being is that those are not natural systems. And so we stripped a lot of the natural safeguards that are in place to protect us from the situation that we now find ourselves in with increasing um, storm events, longer, harder, drier droughts, higher temperatures, um, insects infestations, wildfires. So all these things are now coming to bear, and the system we have in place is really almost set up perfectly to kind of magnify those issues. So this is being seen all over the world. So not just in PEI, but in places like the Harz Mountains in Germany, um, which really kind of created our kind of modern silviculture practices. Their spruce forests have been demolished by the spruce beetle, just like we're experiencing here in PEI. Um, so their natural regenerating forests are actually much healthier. And in fact, they've started they're encouraging those natural forests rather than returning to a kind of plantation model. Um, so, and I guess I'll just start here for a second. So, in terms of what, the recommendations are currently for creating forests that are resilient to forest fire. I mean, often those recommendations include things like reducing vegetation, especially on the surface level, reducing branches, pruning trees, increasing the space between the trees themselves so that canopy is not as closed, removing dead wood, and then planting fire, drought, and rot resistant trees, which would be a miracle tree if that actually existed. It also includes things like planting climate appropriate species and assisted climate species migration as well. So that's kind of on one hand, in response to this is the kind of a lot of um, the wisdom that is now being shared in terms of what forest management looks like in response to to the climate change and the threat of wildfires. And this is kind of where this whole conversation started for me, being involved in this webinar. Was, what should we do with our forests here in PE, and, in the Maritimes, with in response to the threat of wildfire. And it really just isn't one thing anymore. We're dealing with a whole bunch of effects, kind of all compounding on top of one another. Um, and so, uh, what I wanted to talk about, and we're going to get into more broadly, is really how do we rethink the whole problem, perhaps? How do we actually think about what's going on and what is the appropriate response? Because the to reduce vegetation, increase spacing, remove hazard trees, to prune, this is kind of like the model forest um, for that. So we're thinking about well-spaced trees. There's no dead debris on the ground. This is a forest that is, uh, you know, hopefully could resist forest fires. However, that to me looks a lot like the plantations that we had created decades ago and kind of have led to this problem. And so I think we need to think more broadly about what is resilience and how do we participate in that effort as stewards of forest land. So just as a quick note too, those efforts to reduce the likelihood of wildfire have actually had negative effects elsewhere. So in the southwest of the United States, the ponderosa forests are in serious decline, in part due to the fact that they have been spacing trees. They have limited the amount of forest fire, the small, safe, controlled burns. And it's leading to a death of mature species as droughts have increased because there's again just a greater degree of evaporation as the spacing has allowed for more sunlight to hit the forest floor. This is also happening in England and elsewhere. So again, this is an issue that's kind of happening all around the world. So in PEI, um, and in the Maritimes, our forest type is quite unique, and it's called the Wabanaki Acadian Forest Region. I'm just going to give a quick description of what that is because I think it does help us to understand how we respond to climate change. So the Wabanaki forest is really a mixture of two forest types. So from the north, there are the boreal species and trees, and south we have the southern hardwoods, and we're kind of in a mixture right in the middle of those two ecoregions. So we have kind of a mixture of coniferous species and southern hardwoods, and it's definitely not a homogeneous forest by any means. So you'll find upland hardwoods, you'll find conifers growing lowlands, but for the most part, it's an old growth forest that has a very long forest fire um, timelines. And so again, most of the dominant species are tolerant, shade tolerant, and again, it's incredibly diverse and will appear in a lot of different ways. It's not consistently the same throughout the whole region. Um, and it's just full of stories. Like everywhere you look inside our forest, there are incredible communities, connections, resiliences that are naturally part of that system. And everything's kind of working together to create, a forest that evolved over 10,000 years and kind of achieved that climactic status. And really what that means is it's not a forest that has kind of reached the end and then stopped evolving. It's actually at its most dynamic at that point. So we have a forest that in itself is already at the point of being ready to deal with an enormous number of issues. So it has a diversity of heights within the canopy. It has a diversity of species. It is able to grow from coastal to riparian forest to dry uplands, um, and and it's always it exists within the relationship to insects, to pests, to forest fires, but in these kind of much longer time frames. So just one of the kind of stories that you find within our forest, this is a trembling aspen, often kind of considered a low value species here in the Maritimes. And it is one of the favorite trees of our hairy woodpecker. And a hairy woodpecker um, is a cavity nester. So every spring, it instinctually makes a new nest. It is designed to do that. So it has a chisel strapped to its face. Its feet are designed to clamp onto a tree. Even its tail feathers are adapted to help with that. It's got nictating eyelids. So again, it's got all these adaptations designed to help it to excavate a hole in a tree. And it likes the trembling aspen because the wood itself is live but still soft. So it's a great spot for them to make a nest. Now, another cavity nester we have in the Maritimes is the saw-whet owl, but it is not designed for building cavities in trees. It's designed for capturing small mammals. And so it has a hooked beak, it has talons, it has forward-facing eyes, it has all sorts of adaptations itself for its job, but it's really not suited to excavate a home in a tree. So that's why it depends on that hairy woodpecker to create its own a home for it. So again, so you need the trembling aspen, we need hairy woodpeckers, we need saw-whet owls, and again, those are all working together within our ecology. Um, so again, incredibly complex, incredibly nuanced. And these relationships just exist everywhere within the forest itself. And I just want you to kind of think back to that idea of a plantation and the one goal of having kind of that simple goal of having timber. And here we're talking about a whole network of life that supports one another in that effort. And we are part of that system too. So what are we wh- how do what is the best response for us then in this situation? Well, I think the important thing is to keep in mind that um, this this situation is bigger than any one of us, and that our trust, science is a wonderful tool, but it has guided us and been used in many ways that I think we have to honestly say has been misguided at times and incredibly helpful at times. But I think it's key, it's important for us at this moment to acknowledge a degree of humility and to actually start asking ourselves what our end goal is. So if our end goal is timber, like a purely economic goal, that may not in fact create resilience. And if our fear is the loss of that timber, um, are we actually creating a system that is going to be in the long term beneficial for all living things? And so, how do we actually create a system and a forest management approach that will have a long-term benefit for all life here certainly within the Wabanaki Acadian Forest region, but also within, across the planet. And I think that that's the fascinating thing is that we are seeing kind of in an unarguable way the effects of one approach that it has generated a system that is very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, while our wild natural systems contain these kind of safeguards already in place. And so resilience in a lot of ways is the humility to return to potentially something that already existed, that the solution exists with us already in our forests. And so it's not a matter of us needing to do assisted migration or, think about, um, all these other human interventions that, kind of anticipate the challenges we face, whereas we could simply work with nature as it is. So what does that look like? And how much time do I have left?
You have a few minutes, Eric.
Okay, okay, I'll try
Yeah,
to do this
no
quickly.
worries.
So first and foremost, we need to allow forests to simply grow older. And so we need to so we're gonna um, ensure that that there's continuous forest cover and that we're working with that kind of natural succession process where we are guiding forests towards a mature or climactic forest community. And that could take, again, a timeline could look like hundreds of years opposed to just the short term. But again, that commitment has to start somewhere. So, allowing forests to grow older, and then have a multitude of ages, sizes, and trees growing together. We have to plan for dead wood, and that's, I think, a concern right now is, well, what about dead wood as um, fuel for forest fires? It's also important to remember that wood on the forest floor acts like a sponge and actually can help with holding water and retaining water as well. And that a lot of our forests lack that organic matter in the soil to hold moisture, leading to greater drought events, like to negative effects resulting from drought. So again, dead wood, helps our forests weather drought, but it also is an incredibly important habitat for countless species that help with climate change. So everything from birds, there's 27 species of birds on PEI that nest in trees. There's amphibians, there's insects, all of them playing a role in helping to create a resilient forests. In California, they were doing tests on salamanders. Um, to see that their consumption of invertebrates was so high that it was actually slowing down the decomposition, allowing for more carbon to be stored in the soil. So again, everything's playing that role of creating a more resilient forest. We want to work with the native population of plants, and so I think no one knows where climate change is headed, and 10,000 years of trial on the part of nature, I think, guides us in the sense of what we want to use as a species mix. That can change, but I think change as nature guides us. But right now, I think certainly in Prince Edward Island, we have a group of species that are incredibly well suited to adapting to the effects of climate change. And so, I mean, they're old growth, they are long lived. Things like sugar maple, hemlock, white pine, red spruce, yellow birch, rare species like ironwood, shrubs, again, each of them playing different roles, whether it's creating food sources or opportunities for um, pollination. Same with wildflowers. And then also food throughout the whole year. So things like Mountain Ash are incredibly good at creating food for wildlife that stays here throughout the winter. We want to make sure that we're protecting our waterways. They are some of the most important habitats for wildlife, and native species as well as plant species. We want to protect forest soils. We know how important they are to connecting, for the mycorrhizal fungi that connect our forests, for the storage of carbon. And then we want to work with nature as well. So the Fiona caused an enormous amount of trees to fall over sideways, which could have been seen as a devastating fact. But what that does is it takes those old fields and actually starts creating pits and mounds again, and starts creating changing the micro topography of those forests, which is super important. So it's turning the soil, it's mixing it, it's creating spots for vernal pools to form, which in turn can be home for new species that didn't necessarily exist um, within that early successional forest. And then we always want to just encourage complexity. So a force is always trying to create diversity, complex systems, and anything we can do to help with that is really should be a priority of our effort. And just to be able to identify where that already exists in a forest. So in this picture, you can see there's sugar maple, red maple, striped maple. There's just so those are almost all our native species of maple in that one little area. And then we have to rethink about how we actually do harvesting and what we're targeting in our harvests. So can we figure out a way of turning low value products into high value things? And I think we can. We just need to be creative and to kind of reimagine what that looks. And I think that this is almost the most important part of the puzzle is figuring out how to create a new industry, not based on the lowest common denominator, the least expensive product, but actually things of high value that will be used by people for a long period of time and that are created from trees that typically or conventionally don't have any value. So things like this bowl. And then we really do need to help one another fall in love with forests because we are part of this system. So I think the remarkable thing about having done nature education and worked in the woods for as long as I have within this community is to see, and to see how important it is to people. And when they actually do have that opportunity to connect, how it changes them and changes the way they think about forests. And again, if we are going to change, if we're going to adapt, it's really about adapting in ourselves and changing our expectations, our thoughts, our fears, our feelings, and learning to actually trust that nature has our back in a lot of ways. So every spring we do owl prowls, and it's one of the most we have hundreds of people come, and it's just that aha moment for so many people when they realize that a bird that size needs a cavity to nest in. Um, and so you need big trees. If you value having barred owls in your forest, you need to have big trees in your forest as well. And that big trees that have died and are still there. And so again, it's just those small connections opening the window to seeing things in a more complex way that helps people to actually understand what it is we're trying to do in our forests and how we relate to them. So it could be flowers that people are interested in, mushrooms, it could be insects, it could be birds and bird banding, it could be monarch butterflies. All these things are points of connection that help us to remember that we have a fundamental relationship with the world around us. And I think that so much of our fear about climate change results from the fact that we do not necessarily feel that all the time. And so it feels like something that's out of control, where once we see our place in that system, we actually can understand how our actions can have consequence in a positive way. School plantings, teaching children to plant things is just important. And that's it. Am I close to time?
Yeah, I can give you 4 more minutes if you'd like.
Um, I mean, I think if I could, I, I really do hope that, like, I think the big thing is that we just have to rethink the problem. Like, I think it's so, um, we both think we have solutions and we think that there's, in a way that we assume that there is a problem. And I think that the point is that um, that nature really does contain everything we need. And it's a matter of accessing those benefits opposed to trying to force it in one way or another.